well.
Yeah.
Gotcha. Do
Caneland.
you want to become a reporter? Is that your goal?
Yeah, that's what I want to do.
Cool. Very good. That's good. Would you fire away, Jason? Nathan, you let me know what you want to talk about. Sorry, I'm looking at a New York Times article on storm chasers. There's a Jason involved in this, and very interesting.
Yeah.
I love the New York Times. Do you follow them?
I look at them once in a while, not too much.
Gotcha. Well, it's interesting, you young people do, you get your news so much online and not from hard copy stuff, but I'll tell you something, this information age we're in is just amazing. I was watching the ceremony with King Charles over in England, and it's quite interesting to me. I've been over there before. I went over to the UK Met facility. They run their supercomputers for the UK Met Office over in Essex in England, and it's fascinating. And we did a program that involved the British consulate here in town. I worked with a climate researcher, and we did a program for corporate planners who are more and more taking climate change into account in their planning. And it was interesting that they asked that we run a seminar that we did downtown in the Deloitte building one year, and they liked it so much they said we want to stream it across, online. And it turns out the British consulate got wind of this, and they said, "Look, Sir David King, who was the chief science advisor to UK Prime Ministers Tony Blair and Gordon Brown, was going to be in town, so they said he'd like to sit in on this session, and he'll even speak if you want." So they took us out to dinner afterwards, and it was fun to spend an evening talking with him. He was the guy behind putting a series of locks in on the Thames River that had prevented a lot of serious flooding and a record rain event they had a couple of years ago. So at any rate, I'm off on another tangent. You go ahead, Nathan. This is your interview. I'm sorry about that.
That's fine. So what do you think the average amount of tornadoes in Chicagoland do you think we get every year?
The average number of tornadoes, well, statewide, they're about 50. It 50. Comes in around 50. Now, that varies widely from year to year. And, it's interesting. We remember the really big events, the Plainfield tornadoes.
Yep.
I remember back on April 21st, 1967, that was the date of the Belvedere Oak Lawn tornadoes.
Yes.
That was terrible. That storm churned across the area, the whole set of storms in the afternoon. We did a 50-year anniversary interview with a farmer up in Belvedere.
I think I've seen that.
What's that?
I've seen that thing before. That 50-year anniversary thing.
Yeah, it's really amazing. I remember, I had grown up, I was born in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. I don't remember it. Lived there only 2 years. My folks are from natives of Western Pennsylvania. Then we moved out to New Jersey, and my dad, for 13 years, did that crazy commute from New Jersey into New York City. He was a mechanical engineer by trade. But then we moved, and I've been interested in the weather ever since I was a little boy.
That's how I've been.
Up in New Jersey, you don't see these squall lines that we see. And I remember we had moved only 2 years before out here to Aurora. My dad was transferred out here by Henry Pratt Company, which was the scene of that terrible shooting a year or so ago.
Yeah.
But we were out playing baseball in a middle school baseball ground when that squall line in 67 came in.
Oh, wow.
And I remember thinking, my God, this is what I've seen in books. I'd never seen a real live Midwest squall line before that.
Wow.
And I remember we ran over to my friend's house, turned on the TV, and of course all the warnings were starting to come in. This is back in the era before Doppler radar and everything else. But that was to put down a tornado not only in Belvedere, but one in Lake Zurich and one in Oak Lawn. The Oak Lawn tornado killed 35 there and injured hundreds, and ended up churning across the Dan Ryan Expressway in the south end of Chicago and went a mile out into the lake east of the Museum of Science and Industry.
Oh, wow.
And it was a perfect example of the fact that tornadoes can and do happen in the city, contrary to myths to the contrary. But at any rate, 50 is the average. I'm going off on tangents again, Nathan, so I'll turn it back over to you.
So how many tornadoes has the Chicago area seen this year so far? I know the number is low.
Good question. We had the Naperville tornado, and we've had a couple other little small ones. I'm going to guess, I just the number off the top of my head, maybe 3 or 4, something like that. And
So are you at all surprised about the lack of tornadoes not only in the Chicagoland area but in the U.S. as a whole for this year? Because the number is drastically lower than like years past.
Oh, it's very true. It is surprising. I mean, nature's doing strange things on all levels. I mean, climate change is real.
Yeah.
It's happening, and it's distorting the weather in so many different ways.
Mm-hmm.
You know, the problem with climate change is it's not linear. In other words, warm up in a straight line. If you plot the graph, there are little bumps in it and all the rest. But the trend, when you look at decades and a century or more of data, is clear. This planet is warming, and this is having all weather on Earth is driven by differential heating. The fact that one area gets warmer than another one. If you start fiddling, as we are with these gases we put in from fossil fuel emissions, with the way the planet warms, then you screw up the temperature variations that set up the jet streams that in turn deliver rain and support crop production and water supplies. And we're seeing that. I mean, and your record, climate change is not uniform. And this gives the critics of climate science a chance to say, hey, it's not real. Because they look at the quiet, like people in the Midwest. If you just looked at the weather here in the Midwest, we've had a relatively quiet summer around here.
And it's been very hot,
and yet all around us, there have been extreme events. I mean, this heat wave that's just starting to back off out west, still blazing across Oregon and Washington, is like no other this late in the season. We had floods in Kentucky. We had floods in St. Louis. Go through the list of flooding that we've had that is extreme. Hurricanes are strengthening faster than usual. And tornadoes, it's interesting. The modeling that's done doesn't give us a clear answer on what the trend will be in tornadoes. As the planet warms, you increase instability, but you also increase or decrease, depending on where you're talking about, wind shear, which is a critical component into spinning up tornadoes.
Yep.
So there's no question. This has been interesting and unusual. Look at the hurricane season. All the indicators in the Atlantic indicated this was going to be an explosive hurricane season. Yet it appears that, among other things, dust off the Sahara has supersaturated the tropical environment with condensation nuclei, dust particle, and that tends to cut down on tropical cyclone development. So, very interesting.
Yeah, it's very interesting. And I mean, I've seen stuff where it says, we're supposed to have an even more active season than the past couple years, and all of a sudden we're at peak of hurricane season and we're only at letter E for Earl right now. And
it's quite unusual, and you've got all the components of what looks to be an active hurricane season. You have La Nina. La Nina, the cooling of the equatorial Pacific, tends to be accompanied in the Atlantic basin by a decrease in vertical wind shear. And it's one of the ironies of tropical storms and hurricanes that those biggest winds on Earth require a calm environment in which to get their act together. And La Ninas provide that. They cut down on Atlantic basin wind shear, and yet there are other factors involved. We talk about Madden-Julian oscillations. These are waves that oscillate westward from the Indian Ocean area, and they affect vertical motions in the atmosphere over a huge area. And there's been a tendency for the air to sink more over the Atlantic, which is another factor that cuts down on tropical storm development. So it all goes to show that this is an amazing atmosphere that continues to surprise, despite the fact that we model it better today than we ever have in our history, and observe it better today remotely with satellites and Doppler radar and all the rest. The 50 years I've been in this business, I've watched this profession change amazingly. We've come farther in the last 50 years than we had in all the time back to Aristotle, 340 BC, who wrote the first paper, Meteorologica, that started the whole meteorological science. He was wrong about a lot of stuff, but at least he started thinking about what was going on in the planet around him.
Yeah. Do you have any idea, you probably answered this one, do you have any idea for why the number of tornadoes in the U.S. as a whole is lower than average for this year?
Well, it has to do with it. I don't have a clear answer on that. It's interesting. La Nina years tend to be very active in producing tornadoes. And indeed, we've had some really active outbreaks. But it's quite interesting. One thing, we misdiagnosed where Tornado Alley really is. For years, the common wisdom was that it emanated from the plains and occurred along the dry line that occurs out in the plains from Texas up through Oklahoma and Kansas and Nebraska. The Fujita at the University of Chicago was the first one to say, hey, you're overlooking the southeast, Alabama, Mississippi, the Carolinas. And indeed, we've seen a lot of action down there. But no, I don't have a clear answer on why that is so. And by the way, I think a lot of people misdiagnose climate change forecasts as saying there'll be more tornadoes, just like they say there'll be more hurricanes, or they think the science says that. That's not what the science says, nor does the modeling. The modeling says there won't necessarily be more hurricanes. What there will be is stronger hurricanes. And the same with tornadoes. We're seeing that the trend has been for there to be not as many tornadoes, and yet when they occur in family outbreaks that do more damage.
I've noticed that, especially with the La Nina stuff that's going on this year. Like, we had the big outbreaks in March and April. I'm actually surprised that that storm system on March 5th of this year, I'm surprised that died off. And it's a good thing it did before it reached Chicago, because, Iowa, they got hit pretty hard. I'm glad it didn't happen here.
Yeah. Oh, my God. In a way, we're kind of overdue for something to go on around here. We had that late night tornado out by Naperville and in the western suburbs and all, but the Plainfield type tornado that occurred out of season. August 28th, 1990, that's not the time of the year you expect to see an EF5 going through any part of our area. That's the time of the year when thunderstorms tend to be slower moving and they tend to produce heavy rains and flooding. And that one anomalously moved from northwest to southeast, which is what late season thunderstorms do in this area. Our spring tornadoes tend to occur with northeastward moving thunderstorms because that's the orientation of the jet stream more often than not at that time of the year. But our population has exploded. I will never forget sitting at my desk watching this, we called it a level 5 supercell moving down through DeKalb County the day Plainfield was hit. About 3 weeks before, we'd had a similar supercell go through the northern suburbs. And at the time, our spotter network had kind of fallen on hard times. We hadn't had a big tornado outbreak for a while, and we were still using the Marseille's, World War II technology radar to scan the area, and so we didn't have Doppler capability. They put a Doppler add-on on it that really didn't work. And one thing Plainfield did is that we looked at the spotter network. That was completely overhauled. And then they moved up the installation of the WSR 88D Doppler down at Romeoville. So that helped. But in many respects, we're kind of overdue for a big storm.
The last one that's been within the Chicago area was Rochelle in 2015. But that was in the way west suburbs, and that really didn't affect much population.
Yeah, with the population density out there is low, and yeah, I mean, what was the Fairview tornado, 2 fatalities there?
Yeah.
But you're out in small communities in farm country, more or less.
Yeah.
And if you'd taken that storm and superimposed it on the more densely populated, close-in suburbs, the outcome of that would have been totally different.
Yeah, it would have been really bad, especially with as the population of the area starts to move west. If this tornado were to happen now, the fatality count would probably be a little bit more higher, and like the damage, it could have been an EF5.
Oh yeah, no question about it. Excuse me, no question about it. And all tornadoes are fairly small, localized storms. A lot of people say, gee, we haven't had tornadoes for a while, and they don't realize a lot of it has to do with where these things decide to touch down.
Yeah.
And even the biggest tornado is, compared to other meteorological phenomena, not a terribly large-scale event, which has been part of the challenge in forecasting these things and tracking them. They're rather small storms. This Doppler radar capability is a godsend because we're able to see circulations in these thunderstorms. And like in the middle of the night, when even in this day and age, when you have spotters all over the place, scanning the skies, looking and in communication with the weather service and able to pass their information on to be used for warnings, the Doppler is still an invaluable tool at night when you can't clearly see what's going on.
Yeah. What do you think the average number is for average time span for a major tornado outbreak to hit the Chicagoland area? Like, what do you think the average time between one major tornado event to another one?
Yeah, I hear where you're going with that. I don't have an average. I remember I always used to ask Joe Schaefer, who for years was director of the Storm Prediction Center. He'd come up to our Fermilab tornado seminars, which we did for 38 years. We had a veritable who's who of the tornado and severe weather research and forecast community come through those programs. It was fascinating. But I'd always say to Joe, that, the season started slowly. He says, Tom, we always end up winding up with something close to 1,000 tornadoes. And if the season starts early, you find that somehow it'll correct itself, and you get into kind of a general 1,000 tornado reports around the country territory at the end of a season.
And that's exactly what's happening now.
Yeah.
We had an active season in the early year.
It smooths out. It really does.
Yeah. How do you think this trend of the lack of tornadoes will affect the area in the years to come?
Well, I don't think we can. I don't think we ought to put a lot of money on it. That being the case. I mean, we are one tornado away from a disaster. It only takes one, and in the wrong place. We've seen that time and again. A tornado that touches down in a cornfield. Can do its thing. We can't even, technically we're not even able to assess the strength of that tornado unless you have a Doppler radar right there looking at it. And, like the Dopplers that we scan the area with are, by the time the beam, you look at the height of the beam, it's up above the low-level circulation. I mean, when I say Doppler scanning of storm, I mean one of these dowels, these Dopplers on wheels, that you have out there and can look at it and actually take apart the winds in the lower part of the atmosphere. We see from like Romeoville and all the other Dopplers around here, the circulation just above the ground, which is a proxy for where the tornado is underneath it. But we're not actually measuring the tornado itself. We're seeing a circulation that you can extrapolate down to the ground as it producing a tornado. And I don't think a lot of people realize that. But the Fujita scale depends on an assessment of the level of damage as a proxy for what the winds are in that storm. And technically, if you've got a tornado that goes through a cornfield, there's no way to calculate what the EF scale on that is. People look at a tornado and they'll say, "Oh, that's an EF3." That's wrong.
Yeah.
You're not able to do that. Technically, the Fujita assessment of the strength of a storm depends on an analysis of the damage the storm has done, and you're using the damage as an estimate or a proxy for what the winds were inside it. So we're not even able to assess the speeds in a lot of tornadoes unless they've gone through an area where they've done damage.
Yeah. That is very true. Like, if you talk about tornadoes that happened August 9th of last year, a lot of those were in cornfields. So they wouldn't be able to have damage assessments. A lot of them were unrated. And I actually storm chased that day. Quick story I have. One of my friends, he was down in the Sugar Grove area, which is south of Elburn, south of the affected area.
Yeah.
And
my parents lived out there for years. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me see here. So he was south. He was coming back north toward Elburn, like the affected area, and I saw the storm was starting to turn to the south, and I told him to stay south because there looks like there's going to be a tornado that's going to hit Elburn, and luckily it did not. And I also saw a pretty giant one near St. Charles that same day around 7:30, but it was never confirmed by the National Weather Service, and I have a very clear picture of it.
When was this?
August 9th of 2021, so last year.
Gotcha. I see.
Yeah. So yeah, luckily it stayed out in open country area for most part, but it did hit parts of Sycamore too, and luckily it only caused minor damage.
Yes. Well, you ask a great question. The fact of the matter, in terms of what the trend is, that's very interesting.
Yeah.
I get a kick out of you because you clearly are a storm chaser and follow this very, very closely.
Yeah.
Hats off to you, Doug. I don't know what we do without our storm chasers.
Yeah.
I mean, our storm chasers offer us ground truth. We use all these remote sensing tools like satellite and Doppler radar and all the rest. Well, there's nothing like having eyes on the ground to tell us what actually is going on underneath what we're seeing indicated on our remote sensing tools like Doppler radar. But in terms of the trend, the modeling is not clear on that. We run these sophisticated climate models, and they're being run with increasing resolution as we get more and more computing speed. And the signals you get from the modeling that's done are not clear in terms of numbers of tornadoes.
Yeah.
There's no definitive indication we're going to have more of them or anything like that.
Yeah.
The trend that we've been observing has been that these storms tend to occur in families and kind of consolidated and in particular areas, and doing therefore a lot of damage. So it's kind of academic whether there are more of them. The fact is, as our population grows, these things are doing a lot of damage. Yeah. And it'll be interesting to see what the trend is. We know the climate is changing and the nature of storms are changing. How that will affect precise tornado numbers is not 100% clear yet from modeling.
Here's a hypothetical scenario. What do you think the damage and the death toll of a hypothetical Plainfield EF5 tornado hitting today, in that taking the same path, same width?
Yeah.
What do you think the death toll and the damage would be?
Well, you raise an excellent point. I've been to the anniversary gatherings on that Plainfield tornado many times.
Yeah.
And the mayor, one of the recent ones I was out at, made the comment that when that storm struck, I think the population of Plainfield was like 16,000 or something, and I think it's up to like 35,000 now or 40,000. And I see it. I'm from the Aurora area, and my folks moved out to Sugar Grove. I mean, it used to be the western edge of the heavily populated was Randall Road. Now it's out to Old Orchard and fast moving out to Route 47 out there.
Yeah, and that's the area I'm from, because I'm in North Aurora right now.
Yeah, and this is going on north, south, west, not east, because we got a lake. But in northwest Indiana, the same thing is going on. I was down at a book signing for a former colleague, Roger Treemstra. He's in a retirement village in Munster. I hadn't been down there in a while. My God, the growth that goes on in all these areas.
Yeah.
And so you raise an excellent point. I mean, as our numbers grow, there's going to be more impact from the tornadoes that occur. A tornado that would innocently touch down in a cornfield at one time is going to touch down in an area where you got population and structures and homes and buildings. And so, that's an issue. And Ed, one of the Weather Service folks made the comment that, in their view, the Chicago office, it's not a matter of if a tornado will occur with major consequence. It's just a matter of when. Yeah. And it's frightening to think what taking a Oak Lawn tornado or a Belvedere tornado or a Plainfield tornado or a Utica tornado or a Washington, Illinois tornado and putting it in highly populated areas around Chicago will do. I mean, you look what happened in Washington.
Yeah.
And you look at videos of these storms, they do what they do in 15 seconds. I can't tell you the number of videos I've looked at over the years where the person shooting it starts up looking out of their neighborhood and they run down to the basement and at times they keep the video going.
Yeah.
So you hear the carnage going on upstairs and then they emerge a minute later. And my God, inside of 15 seconds time, when you time the roar of the damage that's being done upstairs, their neighborhood has been leveled.
Yeah.
But that happened out in, it was 13 seconds in Washington, Illinois. What these storms do is over in a matter of seconds and transformative in the sense that it just levels whole areas. It scares the living hell out of any of us who do what we do. Yeah. That one of these things comes into one of our suburbs, and it's going to happen eventually.
Yeah, and it's just, and like you said, it's just a matter of when, because it's not always going to be accurately predicted. It can just it could happen tomorrow, and we don't know it.
That's right. But it's interesting. First, Doppler radar has given us a tool. We're getting like an average, 11 to 14 minutes lead time on these storms, which is more than we used to have. It's not much, but it's more than we used to have. And oftentimes, if you got a really potent storm that's on the ground for a long, has a long path length, then you warn about that pretty successfly. What'll be interesting to follow is as we increase computing speed and therefore decrease or increase the resolution of our convective allowing models, the so-called CAMs, then the warning system of the future will consist not only of Doppler radar scans, and of course there's a new generation Doppler that will come online. The estimates I hear in the 2030s, that's the fixed array Dopplers. These will do away with the rotating antennas, and instead they're patterned after the defense that we put on Navy ships against incoming missiles.
Oh, wow.
And there, if you had a radar whose antenna was rotating, scanning the airspace, the volume all around the ship, you'd miss this missile coming in. So what these things do is they have panels, arrays of panels that are continuously sensing the atmosphere. They'll be able to scan an entire cumulonimbus cloud in 75 seconds.
Yeah.
And we're going to learn things about the operation of thunderstorms that we're not able to clearly lay out right now with current Doppler technology. But then that's going to be married to higher resolution models that hopefully will get down to a single storm forecast capability. And so the warning system of the future, it's hoped, will be a marriage of Doppler technology and modeling that will enable, say, a tornado warning to be issued an hour ahead of time. And anticipate the tornado's appearance rather than waiting for a circulation actually to show up, which is what we're doing now with Doppler. And our modeling is better than ever before. We're able to identify areas where these supercellular thunderstorms will develop and time frames in which they'll develop. But we're not down to the point where we can look at a single cell that's going to lay down a tornado. The hope is someday in the future we'll be able to do that. A lot
of my friends always ask me, why does like the National Weather Service, they always issue too many warnings and always a majority of the time get them wrong. and instead of just issue like one and not issue anymore. I always tell them it's always because of what happened after Plainfield. They never issued a tornado warning
Right.
when the
Yep.
tornado hit, and then they only issued it after. And that's why it's called, and I tell them it's called Plainfield syndrome. It's better to issue too many warnings and get them wrong rather than issue just one and it be already too late.
There's some truth to that. What that did to our profession. I mean, we were really wounded by what happened that day.
Yeah.
I remember that storm, and I was watching, and I was sitting at my desk just waiting for warnings to come out. And when they finally put out a thunderstorm warning, it was for DuPage County. It actually headed toward Will County.
Yeah.
And I remember, there's little crawls that we run across the screen. I remember adding a line to it saying, even though Will County's not been warned, this is an area you folks should be on the alert for this thing. That really hurt us because there's real dedication in the field to getting these warnings out, and that was a failure.
Yeah.
And we were, as a profession, felt terrible. And I'll tell you, what's been instituted since then, a complete overhaul of the system and all, the spotting system.
Mm-hmm.
So, and of course, we're now in the internet age. That wasn't, we have social media and all. I can't tell you the number of reports, and often the first read I have on how severe a tornado strike has been comes in by way of social media, reports we get from citizen observers there, and the photos and all the rest. But you know what? I don't think the numbers of warnings, there's been a real effort to cut down this overwarned problem, which is interpreted by many as kind of a cry wolf syndrome.
Yeah.
It used to be that they warned for entire counties. They're trying to cut down the area that is warned for. And I don't think it's a matter of them feeling the necessity to put warnings out just to cover themselves, although I think there are times where that's done. I think what it is we have better tools and are able to see suspicious escalations, and we realize that a lot of these tornadoes in this area can do their thing in a minute or two.
Yeah.
And these storms don't last. We don't have the luxury of long path length tornadoes here that they do, say, out in the plain states.
Yeah.
Some of these mammoth supercellular storm outbreaks down in the deep south. Our tornadoes, a number of them, hit quickly. They're born and they die quickly. They're not around very long.
Yeah, that'd be a QL. That'd be a
we're able to see these little circulations spinning up, and I think warnings are put out on that basis. And they do try to localize them. I think they're doing a better job in the overworn area, which they recognize as a problem. Because if you put warnings out, you have people dashing to the basement, and nothing happens. Over time, they're going to say, "Screw it," we're not going to listen to this, and therefore you nullify the effect of the warnings.
Yeah.
I think. We did a program after Plainfield. I was really frustrated by that because all the TV stations, we all sent anchors out, and they anchored newscasts with all the debris in the background of Plainfield as a backdrop. And yet that was a learning opportunity, a chance for us to communicate what people on the ground, without a warning, might have been able to look at the sky and say, hey, this is something more than a garden variety storm coming. And we attempted in this program, we called it Sounded Like a Freight Train. It was the first one, really. Now you've got programs like that on every 3 times a night on the Discovery Channel and the Weather Channel and everything else. I mean, we have we're saturated with tornado chase programs now. But we tried in that program to show the different forms these tornadoes take. They're very, their appearances vary. You got these multicellular, multi-vortex tornadoes. They're not all these elephant trunk type tornadoes. And also to inform the public on what part of the storm to watch for tornadoes? A lot of people don't realize a lot of the really big tornadoes come out of the rear southwest quadrant of the thunderstorm, and that's after you've gone through the outflow on the front end, and you can spin up these little landspout type tornadoes on the front end of these things. But the really big ones that tend to hang around are in the rear rain-free southwest quadrant of the thunderstorm, where you get the incredible updraft driving the thing. And it's right next to the hail shaft if there's going to be one with a storm, and also outside the heavy rain area. So really, you've gone through the straight line winds that hit on the front side of these storms and can do their own damage that in many cases is as bad as tornado damage. Doesn't take a rotary circulation to do damage. And the roar that sounded like a freight train expression that we hear, all winds sound like a freight train if they're coming through the area, whether they're straight line or rotary. You get roar as they come through buildings and trees and, terrain features and all the rest. You'll get that roar. Straight line winds can be as damaging as tornadic winds. So I think there's an effort to try and inform people to make them self-spotters, to try and give them a little more information. Now, some members of the public aren't interested enough to listen to that. But I think education along those lines is a good way to do it. In other words, put some of the, I remember I said, and it caught the ear of Fred Osby, who was director of the National Severe Storms Forecast Center, the counterpart in those days of the Storm Prediction Center. I said, nobody is going to come and ring your doorbell and say, hey, take cover, there's a tornado coming. We'd like to do that, but it's impossible. So the more we can inform people what part of the storm is likely to be damaging, might be more of a service even than as much of a service as the warning system is. But I'll tell you another improvement, too, is the fact that we're getting warnings out by cell phone. And so people sitting in a pew at church, as happened in Washington, are getting warnings as they're there that they might otherwise not hear because they're not watching television or listening to no weather radio or in front of their computers. And that, I think, has been a big improvement. And there are actual examples of people getting warnings and realizing they were at risk by getting these warnings out through that means of communication.
And I actually heard something about the Plainfield tornado, like the radar operator, when they were in Rosemont, he wasn't able to, tilt the radar to see if there was, any hook forming on radar and all that, and that's why they never issued a tornado warning, because it didn't look like it would produce a tornado.
Well, it's interesting. They did quite they did quite something, a review of what failed in that situation. I mean, they went through the whole system. There were a lot of problems. Back in that Marseilles radar day, when I came to work here, and when I was growing up in this area, the radar was down by the University Museum of Science and Industry, which put its ground clutter array right over the area we were trying to defend. That's why they positioned these radars, although one could make an argument that since a lot of our tornadoes come in from the southwest, even Romeoville was the wrong place to put it. But they've got better algorithms they can run now to cancel out some of the ground clutter and see what's going on. You're absolutely right. I remember there was a flash flood situation down in Joliet, which at the time was right in the Marseilles ground clutter area. And this is a true story. One of the forecasters, Al Morrison, it was a Sunday morning. This thing came in and unleashed an incredible flash flood. And it was buried in the ground clutter. And so they used to talk to the radar operator out in Marseilles. And Al Morrison, one of the forecasters, called out there and he said, "Oh, how's your Sunday going?" Talking to the guy. "You seeing anything you're watching?" And the guy said, I hope they're getting the rowboats out in Joliet. And he thought it was just a humorous comment. Come to realize that no, it wasn't. That there really was a flash flood developing there out of one of these convective cells,
Yeah.
and the torrential rains they were unleashing. So there's no question that some detail is lost in these ground clutter patterns. And you're only, you got to tilt the antenna to look at it. Nowadays, that's done automatically. These new WSR 88Ds go through a volume scan, they call it, and they can set it up in various ways. Like they can scan just the lower part of storms, which they tend to do if tornadoes are imminent, because they want to see the cyclonic circulation showing up in the lowest part of the storm more quickly. And if they're scanning the full volume, it takes about a 5-minute period for the antenna with every revolution to tilt slightly and scan out, more of the thunderstorm vertically. Mm-hmm. It takes 5 minutes for what they call a full volume scan. They can do an abbreviated version of that only looks at the circulation in the lower thunderstorm. That's why this fixed array Doppler will be so great, because it scans so quickly that we'll see the full circulation in the storm more quickly that way.
Now let's, I remember this supercell, June 13th of this year, the one that blew up over northern Illinois, rolled southeast. Do you think that the structure of it, do you think it would have looked similar to like the Plainfield supercell? Because honestly, it kind of did. Kind of looked like like on radar.
In fact, I remember vaguely that one. I'll tell you, I deal with so many of these things, they blur together unless they've done something truly extraordinary.
Yeah.
They tend to isolate those instances. But I think I remember the show, and the comment we made in the office was, "Wow, this thing looks a little bit like that Plainfield situation."
Yeah.
I'll be honest with you, I don't remember the specifics of the atmospheric setup that day, but that comment was made. Every one of these situations has a different setup. Like the Plainfield tornado was really interesting. That had been a summer in which there had been unusually cool air up in Canada, and so the so-called baroclinic zone, that's the thermal contrast zone along which the jet stream develops, had been developing a very strong jet stream, anomalously strong, deep into the summer, when normally those baroclinic zones retreat up into Canada seasonally. That wasn't the case that year. And the day of the Plainfield tornado, I remember there was a 300 millibar jet streak. That's a wind max up there. And at the same time, we had low 80-degree dew points, which is top of the line.
Yeah.
And that, by the way, is a real something to look at. The moisture content of the air lends latent heat energy to the atmosphere, which is incredible. And I've always found that when you get like 2-inch or greater precipitable water values or dew points in the low 80s, the breed of thunderstorm you get out of that atmosphere is really something. So we brought a front that day with a northwest wind converging with a southwest wind. Then in our area, we had a lake breeze component to it that went inland roughly to Will County.
Yeah. So
you had 3 axes of convergence going on that blew up 2 supercells down in Plainfield. I remember walking out of the station, and it was completely clear here in Chicago. The lake breeze had scoured the skies clean of any clouds, and yet you could see the towering CBs to our southwest and their anvil tops.
Yeah.
And I remember Fujita made the comment. There were a lot of interesting speculation about what produced that storm. I was called by SUNY Albany, the department out there, which has done a lot of work on lightning. And there was a theory that floated around for many years in meteorology that was dismissed, but seemed to be something they were again looking at, an electrical theory. They had noted an anomalous lightning pattern the day of the Plainfield tornado, which they had seen in 5 other EF5 supercells. And that was a pattern in which the lightning that the storm was producing had a positive charge to it. Lightning production ceased about the time the tornado emerged, and when it resumed again, you went back to the more normal negatively charged lightning discharges. Yeah. And I remember a researcher calling me from SUNY Albany saying, "Did you get any unusual calls from people observing that storm about unusual lightning displays?" And I found out later in investigating that what they were looking at was this unusual preponderance of positively charged lightning strikes That had been observed with the Andover, Kansas EF5 tornado, which had been amazing. That was the one that went right by Chanute Air Force Base out there. Had it, on a path just a half a mile different, it would have taken out a whole row of fighter jets, which would have made it easily the most expensive tornado in U.S. history because of the damage it would have done. But nothing came of that. But there was actually, there were people thinking, God, apparently that meant the structure of that, the electrical structure of that set of supercells flipped during that tornado emergence, which was quite interesting, suggesting there was an unusual arrangement in the electrical structure of that storm. And that probably had to do with the updrafts and downdrafts and the way those were distributing charges through the cloud, which is what electrifies a cloud and starts it producing lightning. But Fujita had an interesting, he called it the Twin Towers formula. He felt that maybe the reason the Plainfield tornado was as violent as it was that the outflow from a nearby cumulonimbus merged with the outflow from the other tower, cloud tower, and that the convergence of those outflows had led to a particularly vicious spin up of the circulation that enhanced the Plainfield tornado's intensity. That was quite interesting. And back in those days, we didn't have we had the nested grid model was our highest resolution model. We didn't have the HRRR model or these other CAM models, convection allowing models that we do today with 3-kilometer resolutions, which by today's standards is pretty damn high. And we didn't get, for instance, computer projections of capes. Nowadays, this is available to us. When you did a post-storm analysis, you calculated the CAPE, the convective available potential energy, which is an invaluable assessment of the buoyancy of the atmosphere and the tendency of rising air to spin. And nowadays our models kick that kind of stuff out. But what we had from the nested grid showed a minus 12 lifted index. That was one of our major stability measures at the time. A post-storm analysis showed the thunderstorms, the atmosphere on the day those thunderstorms emerged in Plainfield had a CAPE of 8,000 joules per kilogram.
Yeah, that's high.
Which is extraordinary. I mean, 1,000 joules per kilogram will give you a violent thunderstorm capable of tornado production. To get 8,000 is off the scales.
Yeah.
And so, these days, the tools we have available to assess when a thunderstorm may go severe are beyond anything we had back in those days.
Yeah.
So, at any rate, I'm rambling here again, but it's an interesting era in which to be tracking severe weather, that's for sure.
Yeah. You might have answered this one already. Do you think the lack of tornadoes should be a cause for concern in the Chicago area?
The life of a tornado?
No, the lack of them, because it could lead up to something.
I'm always nervous about that.
Yeah.
I adhere to the Joe Schaefer notion that over a period of time you're going to get a certain number of tornadoes.
Yeah.
And if you haven't, nature has a way of, even though we've got all kinds of anomalies showing up in our extreme weather events, we're getting temperatures we've never seen before, rainfalls we've never seen before, hurricane intensification rates we've never seen before, even lack of tornadoes we've never seen before in certain periods. This concerns me because at some point, if you look at a long enough period of time, there are going to be a certain number of tornadoes in a region on average. And even in this anomalous climate-changing regime we're in today, there's still some truth to that. And therefore, the lack of tornadoes concerns me because it's only, what it screams is there's only a matter of time. It's like waiting for the big earthquake out in California.
Yeah.
Nobody can predict when that's going to occur. The science simply doesn't support a forecast system at this point.
Yeah.
But just based on historic trends, that there's going to be a big one, that's a seismically active area. And the same is true here on the meteorological front. I mean, we're in a region where geography just the structure of the atmosphere dictates you're going to get a certain number of tornadoes. And the fact we haven't had big ones for a while, all the while the population is growing in this area that we know it to be tornado prone.
Yeah.
Set off alarm bells in, I think, anybody's head who's in meteorology around here, that the day will come when something horrible happens.
Mm-hmm.
And what we've got to do in the interim is drive home the fact that, A, tornadoes can occur, but the quiet period isn't to be assumed to be something that's going to continue indefinitely. And here's what to do if a tornado situation evolves, because you're not going to have much time to think about it.
Yeah.
The first sign you may have that a tornado is occurring is you hear your house breaking up around you.
Yeah.
That's the wrong time to have any plan in your head as to what to do to get out of harm's way there. You know, stay away from flying debris or crush injuries when the building comes down on you. And so that's why it's so important we continue to educate folks as to what to do when a tornado occurs.
Mm-hmm. Do you think that Lake Michigan may have something to do with the lack of tornadoes? It's a common myth that the lake prevents the tornadoes from like hitting the city, but like out toward like the Aurora area. Do you think the lake may have something to do with lack of tornado development?
No, I don't. Look, I'll tell you, you walk a fine line there, because you know as a meteorologist that a tornadic thunderstorm requires buoyancy.
Yeah.
You've got, thunderstorms produce two types of damaging winds. The outflow, that is rain-cooled air crashing down to the surface and hitting like a microburst. Fujita always likened it to taking a running garden hose and pointing the flow of water at the ground to explain how that works. The water coming out of the hose is the air that drops out of the thunderstorm when it gets beyond its mature stage, and that cold air that's been held aloft comes crashing down to the surface, hits, fans out in all directions, and you get straight line winds.
Yeah.
But the tornado develops when you get updrafts into the storm, and the tremendous upward motion of air causes air to rush in, begin rotating because of Coriolis, and you twist that initial horizontally spinning air into a vertical column that is the tornado. And so Lake Michigan can deter tornadoes in certain situations by infusing colder, heavier air off the lake if drawn into the area. But you don't want to communicate that as a complete deterrent to tornado formation in the lake, in the city, because we know that tornadoes have gone through the city.
Yeah.
The right synoptic situation, the right placement of a jet stream that helps develop these incredible upward vertical motions, and the presence of buoyant, warm, humid, latent energy-rich air that is rising, and to produce a rotating supracellular thunderstorm. Mm-hmm. Believe me, the infusion of cool air from the lake is not going to deter that storm from producing a tornado that goes into the city. So, and definitely out in Aurora, the effect of the lake on convective activity is minimal.
Yeah.
Where it may affect thunderstorm development is the inflowing, the inland moving easterly wind off the lake can converge with southwest winds that might be blowing out away from the lake. Mm-hmm. And you converge air. If the air piles up at the surface, it's got to go somewhere. It can't go into the ground. So it starts to rise. And you see it with these lake breeze cumulus clouds that develop into showers at times along the periphery of the lake, inland from the lake. It'll be sunny here in the city, right up against the lake, and yet you'll watch these towering Q develop all around. I live here on the lake, and I can see them developing over in Michigan and northwest Indiana. Wow. Not a cloud in the sky overhead, yet these things develop, and that's where that inland moving lake breeze is converging with the wind flow. So that can enhance thunderstorm development in those areas. In some cases, you can bust a cap and get storms to blow up. Mm-hmm. But I don't think the lake can be indicted as the reason for either a lack of tornadoes or the number of tornadoes out, say, in the Fox Valley area.
Yeah. I got one more question. What advice could you give me for like schooling? If I want to go to college for like study meteorology, what advice could you give me for that?
Well, I'll tell you, there are amazing schools, all kinds of them. Florida State, University of Oklahoma, the University of Wisconsin, where I went to school up in Wisconsin. That's the birthplace of satellite meteorology.
Oh, wow.
There was a guy up there by the name of Werner Sumi who his dream was to have floating platforms in Earth orbit that would watch every weather system from birth to death. And he was the guy who developed the spin scan approach to the geosynchronous satellites. That's where the satellite, rather than being up there at 22,300 miles and pointing a camera at the Earth, was spinning. And therefore, the heat sensors and the cameras were scanning out the planet line by line by line from a 22,300 mile orbit.
Yeah.
And about 20 minutes time scanning out a full disk image. And because you would put full resolution in every line that you scanned out of the planet as you were building a full disk image, you had incredible resolution. And you could take that highly resolved full disk image and blow up sectors with great deal of resolution in it. And his dream has come to be true. He talked to his research colleagues all over the world, and they'd work on international projects. And he'd say, look, lobby your governments to get satellites up there. Well, now we have them. The Japanese have geosynchronous orbit satellite up there. The Indians do. The Europeans do. We do. And between all of us, and we freely exchange these satellites, we watch the whole planet. The ability to remotely sense the planet, which is 70% water and therefore poorly observed in those oceanic areas, revolutionized our ability to model the atmosphere because we could suddenly get data from the data-free or data-poor ocean areas to plug into our computer models, and that makes numerical modeling possible. You've got to put the whole planet in to get a forecast even for Chicago, because what's going on even across the other side of the planet immediately has an impact on the jet streams that blow in our area and the upper air patterns that produce our weather. So anyway, Wisconsin specializes to this day in satellite meteorology, but they have a great program across the board. Florida State looks at tropical meteorology. Oklahoma specializes in severe weather. Penn State, great program out there. Valparaiso University here in Northwest Indiana, they have a wonderful meteorology department down there. Small school like Linden State out in New England, but they do a great job and have great success in placing their students in operational meteorology and all forms of meteorology jobs. Northern Illinois University here, great program with a great success in putting young people. They have populated the field of meteorology with meteorologists who come through their program. So I'll tell you, you got a range of programs. Texas A&M. There are all kinds of schools. And you kind of have to look at what you're interested in. And I think a lot of people are surprised at meteorology programs. I'd argue that some of these schools don't do an adequate job in preparing synoptic meteorologists, which are what a lot of people are going to do. I mean, a lot of people go into meteorology, become forecasters. That's called synoptic meteorology. And I've often thought that they spend so much time in teaching dynamics that they shortchange forecast techniques, which, I believe when you go to college, you got to be in meteorology courses from the day you get in there. If learning the codes and learning how to plot and watching the models handle situations so that you get a familiarity and a feel for the way they operate, although, improvements are made in models so much anymore that a given model is quite different a year later than it was when you started looking at it a year before, because they've improved the physics package and also the initialization schemes and all the rest. And more, what's being done is ensembling. We have such computing speed available now. You don't look at one particular computer model. Often we're prone to say, here's the American model and here's how they differ in their forecast. That's not what we're doing anymore. We're looking at blends of model more and more. We're looking at all the models from all the global centers. Every day when I pull down data for our forecast, I'm looking at the Korean model, the German model, the European model, and its ensemble. The ensemble model is different than the single run deterministic model that we look at. Same with our US GFS model. They run a deterministic run, which is one version of the model, but then they perturb the initial data that goes into the model. In the case of our US model, 28 different ways, and the Europeans do it 52 different ways. And in other words, they take the initial data set, they reinterpret it 52 different ways. And because we don't perfectly measure the atmosphere. Mm-hmm. So there are assumptions made. When you send a weather balloon up in Peoria and another one out at Des Moines, you're making assumptions about what the atmosphere is doing in between those data points. And there are different ways to make assumptions. And they find that when you take the same data set and you reinterpret it, you run the physics package, the fluid dynamics equations that advance the atmosphere through time, that you arrive at different solutions, sometimes radically different. I mean, look at what goes on when snowstorms are coming in. Everybody will focus on one model's deterministic run. And 1 minute it's telling you you're going to get 20 inches of snow. Mm-hmm. The next minute it's telling you the next run, hours later, it says, no, we're down to 6 inches. So how do you reconcile these wild swings? And it really shows up when you're looking at these small scale models, these so-called convective allowing models that we use so much for severe weather forecasting. Mm-hmm. Those things wildly vary from run to run. And so that's why this REF model that's run by SPC, which essentially is an average of 10 different forecasts from 5 different versions of WRF models, is so good because it smooths out these run-to-run wild gyrations and all that are so confusing and difficult to reconcile. When you average across models, you find the average product is really quite impressive and also quite stable. You don't get these wild run-to-run variations and all that people overinterpret, especially young people that are new to looking at models. I see all this stuff on social media where there are interpretations of these models, and it shows an unfamiliarity with models when they say, oh, the storm has been canceled by the model. No, sometimes the forecast that models have made 2 days before on a snowstorm is better than the forecast that immediately comes out of the model, the most recent forecast. So it's wise to average across these models, and that's what's being done more and more. So schools that work on synoptic, if you're going into the research end, then look at whether that department is producing researchers or whether or not it's training people to go into forecasting. Where do their students end up working in the field? And it's wise to, in evaluating the school you want to go to see where their graduates are working in the field of meteorology and what your own interests are as to what you want to do in meteorology.
Okay.
Like, what is your interest, Nathan? Do you want to research? Are you interested in forecasting or what?
For me, it's pretty much forecasting and a little bit of research as well. So, I mean, like me for forecasting, it sounds like University of Oklahoma would be a very good one because like forecasting severe weather is something I've loved doing and something I want to keep doing for a very long time.
Keep in mind, though, one thing I find is a lot of young people that are coming out, they've all gone through these tornado chase programs and all the rest, and they're interested in severe weather, and then the interest kind of ebbs, And the fact is, we have thunderstorm days only 30 or 40 days a year. Yeah. Out of the 365 days. There's a lot of weather that goes on that's very significant and eventful. For instance, in this climate change era where we're getting heat waves at greater extremes or huge precipitation events, this becomes really critical beyond the handful of supercellular thunderstorms that produce tornadoes. Those are important, but it's also important to get solid grounding in other weather events that go on, because the majority of the year is not impacted by severe thunderstorms. It's impacted by extremes of cold or warm or else just fair weather, where pollution builds up. So it's important to be well-rounded and briefed on, particularly in a changing climate regime, on climate change and what's happening there and what this means for the future and all the rest. And also the forecasting you'll be doing the majority of the year, not those days where you get, violent thunderstorms. They're important because they can do a lot of damage and produce a lot of injury. Mm-hmm. But they're not the only thing on the scene.
Yeah.
And I found that interest seems to wane unless you've got a squall line coming in somewhere in the future. And I never can quite figure that out because I think the majority of the year we're looking at something other than severe thunderstorms. It's critical to know what's going on there, but it's also critical to evaluate the incoming Arctic outbreak or the upcoming heat wave or the upcoming flash flood situation, which really is devastating when it happens.
Yeah.
Every bit as much as supercellular thunderstorms and the tornadoes they spin up.
Yeah. I mean, the entire field of meteorology is just very interesting. I've been watching weather stuff for 9.5 years. First time I watched something weather related was the Moore, Oklahoma EF5 on May 20th, 2013, and when I just watched that blow up to 1.5 miles wide, it just astonished me at how big these are, and it just inspired me to do research and try and improve warning times, trying to save people's lives. Because after what happened, it was just devastating.
It was. That was a hell of a storm.
Mm-hmm.
And, what's amazing is, too, that area had been devastated only 2 years before.
Yeah, May 24th, 2011.
Yeah. I mean, it's just, I went down there to give a talk. The Storm Prediction Center does conferences for emergency government planners, and Joe Schaefer, who had come up year after year to my Fermilab tornado seminar, would invite me down there, and I always came up with some reason I couldn't go, mainly because I had on-air duties, and it was hard to get off and do that. And whenever you give a talk, it's not just the talk you're giving. It usually means you spend weeks preparing the talk and all the rest on top of the 12 to 14-hour operational forecast data you're doing every day. So I take very seriously when I commit to giving a talk. I was down at the University of Illinois a couple weeks ago. Former Governor Jim Edgar he has a gathering called Edgar's Fellows. These are young legislators at all levels of government, and what he does, he brings them together every year, and they get a week full of experts talking on various subjects that will affect these legislators, or on which they'll have to produce laws and public policy to deal with them and all, from flooding to tornadoes to everything else, food crises and all the rest. But they called me up a couple of years ago and they said, look, we'd like to do one on climate change. So I talked them into bringing a friend of mine who worked as a researcher at Argonne Labs, and we did that. But I spend months getting ready for those talks, and it's because there's a lot of research and all that goes in. I wish there were more hours in the day. That's why we're doing this interview on a Saturday, because during the week, if I do an interview like this, I can't talk like this, for an hour or whatever we talk, because I screw up the rest of my day. I can't get my stuff ready, and the deadlines don't move at night. You got to be ready to go on the air at a certain time and be fully briefed and cognizant of what's going on. But I'll tell you, I think it's wonderful. There's no question severe weather events, I think, pique our curiosities. I remember as a kid growing up in New Jersey watching Hurricane Donna going up there, and God, we had a non-tropical storm that went in March back in the early 60s. It changed the entire East Coast, sent 40-foot waves in, changed the landscape. National Geographic devoted an entire issue to what had gone on. My grandparents at the time lived down on the Intercoastal Waterway in Pompano Beach, Florida. This is before that area had grown the way it has now. And they had a perfectly clear sky, and yet the wind was blowing gale force down there from the same storm that was devastating, the Mid-Atlantic and New England and all, and much as Superstorm Sandy had done.
Yeah.
And so I remember they had to leave their home because the tides were so anomalously high that the intercoastal waterway was flooding their house that was on it.
Wow.
And I thought, wow, the scale. At one point, there were gale force or greater winds blowing from the Florida Keys to the northern tip of Maine. And that was an amazing storm. But I remember that storm. And then, of course, when I moved out here, I remember the April 21st squall line and the Oaklawn Belvedere tornado. So, yeah, I think we're all interested in stuff like that.
Yeah.
I remember they would send me, whenever a hurricane hit down there, the newspapers would do a special section on the storms that hit. And it was always interesting to go through those and see what was going on.
Yeah.
So, well, you clearly have a passion toward meteorology, and I salute you for that, Nathan. It'll be interesting to follow your career and see what you decide, where you decide to go to school and what you decide to do with it all. I think that's great.
Yeah, and I've been a big fan of WGN for a very long time, and I remember when you guys have done when you brought little kids in to do the forecast. That was always my dream to meet you and talk to you, and now I finally have fulfilled that dream.
Well, I tell you, they started that on the morning show.
Yeah.
And it's a perfect time to do it because they have a lot of time and all. And I think it is good to give young people a chance.
Yeah.
You young people today, my God, you've got access to all of our models and all the rest. I mean, a young person today, when I was a kid, part of the problem was getting real-time weather data.
Yeah.
You couldn't do that in the pre-internet. And there aren't enough opportunities for young people to get involved with the field. Now, you're storm chasing. I think that's fantastic. Yeah. You've clearly interfaced with the Weather Service and storm spotting programs. And today you can get on the line and look at models and all and get a kind of a feel ahead of even being professionally involved in the thing and how these things are handling storms and all the rest. Mm-hmm. And I'm a great believer. I think the more time you look at evolving weather situations and the way tools like modeling handles it. Louis Uccellini, who was finishing his doctorate when I was up at Wisconsin, a group of us would get together whenever a storm was coming together up in the communications room up there on the 14th floor of the Space Science and Engineering building. And it's interesting, out of that building comes a lot of the tools. You'll see the National Hurricane Center reference SIMS satellite products. In fact, tropical forecasters around the world do. Mm-hmm. But we get together there, and Louis later became a head of the Weather Service. He just retired. And I said to him, Louis, can you believe from those days when we gathered in the early 70s up at the University of Wisconsin and looked at what was available in the way of models in those days, that was only starting to happen out in operational meteorology. Mm-hmm. When you compare that to where we are today, my God, it's a different world. And he just shakes his head. He said, I know. He said, I would never believe it would all happen so fast. So who knows where we're going with all this? It's only going to get better.
Yeah, and that's good because that means there's still people that care about this stuff and they want to improve warning times, save people's lives, possibly get even more people.
We have a lot of brilliant young minds. It's always fun to talk to young people interested in this because you're our future.
Yeah.
And you will be just as we as young people, we're going on to careers in this field and have been witnessed in the last 50 years to changes that I could only have dreamed about.
Yeah.
And God only knows what you're going to see, Nathan, in your lifetime.
Yeah.
In the field. It'll be interesting.
On Monday, I spoke with Gino Izzi from the National Weather Service. And he talked about stories about him being on the weather show on WGN, I think in the morning, and then going to the Fermi Lab thing you do.
Yeah.
And I remember he was talking about how you remembered him as when he was a kid.
Yes. He would call me with questions.
Yeah.
And and it's funny. Then I fell out of touch with him. He went to school at NIU,
mm-hmm.
and he is brilliant. He's an amazing analyst, and brings to the to the table the same sort of devotion and interest that you do. And I'll tell you something, and that I did. You can kind of spot the people that are going to go on with this. And it's always amazing to me the number of people who, when you talk to them about how they got to where they are today in the profession, they started at young ages. And, this has been a passion since childhood. And it was for me, too. And Gino was, he was really, he asked probing questions, and I was always impressed by that.
Yeah.
I thought, this young guy is somebody who, you see in a second when somebody's bitten by the bug, it really is quite interesting.
Yeah. And when I interviewed Gino on Monday, he said that, like, all the knowledge I know of, it kind of reminds him of when he was younger, and he would always ask all this stuff. It kind of reminded him of, reminded him of how he was when he was younger.
Yeah, absolutely. I concur with Gino 100%. And I get such a kick out of young people. Who have this passion. My parents could never figure out where this came from. Yeah. They wanted a doctor or a lawyer. They didn't want to. I remember I go into Chicago for a doctor's appointment, and I was always frustrated by the fact my parents couldn't quite understand why this was all so interesting. And so I remember one time they had an office the Weather Service did. It was then the Weather Bureau down at the Federal Building, and so we were going in for a doctor's appointment. I said to my mother, "Hey, Mom, let's go by the Federal Building and stop." And I thought, boy, when she sees these clacking teletypes and the maps on the wall and all the people there, she's going to think this is really great. And so we go into the office, and of course, I'm just like a kid in a candy store. I used to get on the train and go down to the University of Chicago office where they, years ago, did the forecast for Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, Indiana, all from that office. And while other kids were going to baseball games, I was getting on the train and coming in to go to the weather office down there on Woodlawn Avenue. Ted Fujita's lab would wind up being up the street from there. But my mother, I took her in, and when we were done looking at this, visiting the office, and we talked to some people there, I said, "Well, Mom, what do you think about meteorology?" She said, "If you ever work in a place like that, I'll die 1,000 deaths." And I thought, but my parents were wonderful. They fully backed me when they realized that they couldn't figure out why their kid had this interest, but that it clearly was coming out of somewhere, and so this was something to be supported. And my parents were wonderful. My dad, for my 5th grade birthday present, he wrote the head of the Weather Bureau in New York.
Oh, wow.
And they were at Rockefeller Center and said, "Look, I've got a son who's interested in the weather," and he brought me and my 5th grade teacher into New York City, which he went into every day to work. And we went, that was the first time I saw radar. They had the radar antenna, radome, on top of the RCA building, which is where NBC's headquarters studios are. Mm-hmm. And they were on the 2nd floor there inside Rockefeller Center. And that was like dying and going to heaven. Mm-hmm. And then I go down to the office here at the University of Chicago, and they had the radar right by the Museum of Science and Industry. And the guy who ran the radar said, he said, "We keep tapes of big weather events." He said, "You want to see some of them?" And they were little cassette cartridges where they had taken shots of the radar screen and that you were able to animate them.
Wow.
Well, we had no access to that kind of stuff in those days, as a young person. But that was great.
Yeah.
And so I'll tell you, I understand exactly what you're saying. And Gino spots the same thing I do in you, as we do in other young people who are interested in the weather. Yeah. My great regret is I don't have as much time now to talk to young people as I used to. We used to have visitors in every night. Wow. We've gotten so busy now, I can't do that. And then we took on the Tribune weather page, which we decided to get out of that. We did it for 25 years. And because there's more emphasis being paid to our web pages, our digital page. So we thought, instead of producing information that we're giving to the Tribune for nothing, let's put it under our WGN umbrella and do it, build our website, which is what we're doing now.
Yeah.
And so we scrapped it. And back in those days, you could, it made sense to do the newspaper weather page because it helped promote your television product. But, newspaper readership is down now. It's not what it used to be.
Yeah.
And so we decided to transfer our efforts. And we have an amazing team. I have 40-plus year veterans of the Weather Service who are retired now who work with me, including Steve Kahn. Paul Daly was head of the Weather Service. Paul Daly went to work after all those heat wave deaths in the city back in July 1995.
Yeah.
Mayor Daley called the weather community together and said, help us anticipate these extreme heat events that are killing people. Nobody realized how deadly heat was at that time. And Paul Daly worked with John Wilhelm, who was the health commissioner of the city, to develop the city's approach to heat waves now. And now they open cooling centers and, actively promote keeping an eye on the elderly and those who are retired and maybe don't have family members to keep an eye on their health and all. And we do that now during heat waves. But that was Paul Daly who did that. So it's fun to work with these folks.
Yeah.
We had always worked across phone lines and went out with camera crews and all to do specials on tornadoes and all the rest.
Yeah.
But these are the folks I work with when we put our Fermilab programs together. It's too bad you didn't get to those. You're young, and they weren't. We did that for 38 years. I've shifted my attention now to climate change issues in terms of presentations. And I've been speaking to groups all over with our congressional reps and all the rest about climate change and the impact that's having. And it's been very rewarding to do that. And it's good to see a Republican, ex-Republican governor interested in the subject, because oftentimes it's only Democrats who treat the subject like there's some validity to it. I've often said this is not a political issue. This is a scientific issue that we all ought to be talking about, and so it's good to see interest on that side of the aisle, and this at least by one member of their party anyway. So that's good.
Like me, like you said, your parents didn't know like where you got into the weather. That's sort of how I am. Like none of my family likes the weather. I'm the only one who does, and it's just confusing how all of a sudden I stumbled into it.
I know, and who knows where that comes from.
Yeah.
I had a psychic tell me that I was a ship captain in a previous life, and that's where this came from. Well, I don't know whether I believe that or not, but I have no other explanation for how ever since I can remember, I used to have paper routes and save my money to buy weather equipment, and I couldn't buy very much because I only made $3 or $4 a week.
Yeah.
So I remember my big purchase was a barometer and a sling psychrometer and an anemometer. Oh my God, I thought I had died and gone to heaven when I had wind measurement gear up on the roof. My dad knew somebody who worked for Taylor Instruments Company and got it at half price. Of course, nowadays, if I were around today, I'd be doing what I'm doing, even professionally, getting on every website I can get onto to get every piece of data I can get my hands on, and following the research that's being done. And that's all out there online now. It's really stunning what's available.
Yeah, I mean, technology has come a long way, and that's good. It
is. I mean, there are a lot of negatives to this technology. I mean, social media has done a lot of harm.
Yeah. But
it's also done a lot of good.
Yeah.
I find in storm situations, it's my primary source of what's gone on in areas that have been hit. I can watch it going in on radar, and I can see the reports that are being filed. But when I have somebody in a neighborhood who's, a house has been taken out or power's out and trees are down all over, and they send me pictures and reports about what they're going through, this is a stream of information I could have gotten no other way.
Yeah. And
so it's invaluable. So there's a case where social media is performing a positive function, not spreading a bunch of scientific malarkey and all on vaccinations or whatever else, the latest, questioning of science, climate change and all this kind of stuff, which is ridiculous because it's happening.
Yeah.
And people better wake up to it. And unfortunately, the way we're going to address it is going to take powerful entities like government to invest money the way they did in building the interstate system and putting Doppler radars in and funding our weather observation and forecasting system. That's pretty critical.
I know, it's just amazing of what all of this can do and how it can just save people's lives in sense.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Nathan, it's been great talking to you, and I'll tell you something. Keep up the interest in the weather and let me know how you're doing, and that's great. It's been fun to talk. You clearly have been bitten by the bug, and who knows why we're bitten by it, but we are. So that's good. Good luck in your studies and your future decisions on where you want to go to school and all that kind of stuff. That's good.
All right. Thank you very much. It's been very, very, very fun to do.
Well, it's been interesting. And tell your mom thanks. Your mom did a great job getting in touch, and so you keep up the interest. That's good.
Yeah.
Say hi to everybody for me.
Okay. All right.
Okay. See ya.
Yeah. Have a good day.
You too, Nathan. Bye-bye.
Bye.